Konnichiwa, and welcome to the Deview, where there's a 0% chance of hearing that something is good, there's a 0% chance of hearing that something is bad, and there's an 80% chance of a new Pokemon Snap related lawsuit. As a little boy growing up, I loved monsters. As a fully grown 23-year-old adult, I love monsters. I certainly love them a lot more than I love killing them. If Monster Befriender Rise ever comes out, you can bet your gosh darn bottom dollar that I will be right there at the midnight release. Alas, hunting these monsters is the only way I'm able to get close with them and appreciate them in all their extravagantly realised grandeur, so I guess that'll have to do for now. For a game about playing whack-a-mole with dinosaurs and comically oversized samurai swords, Monster Hunter sure is complicated. And it's been that way since day one. I started with Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate on the 3DS, but lost my copy shortly after my first fight with the Najarala. Then Monster Hunter World came out while I was at university, and I logged just under 100 hours in its first week. Wow, I have issues. I should note, obviously, I didn't play for nearly 100 hours in a week. I don't even know if that'd be possible, but I had my PS4 powered on with Monster Hunter World running for nearly 100 hours, which I think still says a lot. Now, Monster Hunter Rise is here, and half of this shit still doesn't make sense to me. I had very little experience of the archaic pre-2018 Monster Hunter, where you had to stop to consume and pick up items, and every zone of a map was separated by a loading screen. But even playing this series in this comparative era of convenience, where World brought about this unholy tidal wave of quality of life changes that Rise has carried over, I still find myself completely swallowed up in the just daunting amount of mechanics these games have. Let me put it this way. The series is called Monster Hunter, and it has more features than it has creatures. Yes, that is the best line in this video. Sorry, we've peaked early. There are 14 different unique weapons you can use in this game. Each of them have their own unique strengths, weaknesses, combos, and controls. Some of them are ranged weapons, which means they require you to manage different ammo types to gain the advantage, ammo types that you'll need to craft from materials you find out in the world. There's the Insect Glaive, which is like a staff that you fight with, but it also comes with like a mechanical insect companion that you shoot at monsters to collect essence, which comes in different colours, that colour depending on which part of the monster you shot the insect at, and each colour representing a different buff that the essence will give you. But apparently you can also combine the colours to make like some kind of multi-buff. Did I mention it's a staff, by the way? Yeah, it's a fucking staff and you jump around with it. And then there's this horn, man. I don't know what the fuck's going on with this thing. Up until Rise, I'd been very happy being an Unga Bunga Mongo Chongo Dual Blades main. I just go into demon mode, run around like Naruto, switch my brain off, and do whatever the fuck I want. Also like Naruto, the show, not the character. But in Rise, I figured I'd challenge myself and try out a new weapon, something a bit more sophisticated. So obviously I went with a sword and shield, which I'm aware sounds like a joke, but it's actually a fair amount more complicated, okay? I can backstep out of any combo midway through to try and initiate a perfect rush, which is basically like a super combo to get crazy damage. Or I could do a leaping slash to initiate a rising slash, at which point I've got to make another decision between falling with another slash or using a shield bash instead to try and build up KO damage on a monster. I can block. There's a lot of stuff going on here. Little did I know that Rise was going to throw me a curved rice ball in the form of the wire bug anyway. Basically a detached grappling hook you can use in the world anywhere, anytime. Mostly for mobility and traversing the maps far more conveniently, but also for combat in the form of silkbind attacks. By doing the wire bug input alongside one of your attack buttons when you have your weapon out, you'll perform a silkbind attack, of which every weapon has two. Oh, but there are switch skills where you can switch a silkbind attack with a cool new unlockable one, but you can only switch out one at a time. But apparently there are switch skills for your normal non-silkbind attacks too? Anyway, so silkbind attacks do unique damage to monsters that build up to staggering them so that you can bind them, jump on their backs, and then do this thing called wyvern riding, where you now fight with the monsters who have their own unique moves and control scheme. By the way, have I explained the rampage yet? So there's this unique mode where you fight monsters in waves in this kind of tower defense format, and you need to set up and manage installations, many of which you need to man yourself and learn the control schemes for to repel these monsters from destroying gates to protect your village. Sometimes unique and super powerful Apex monsters show up at the end of these rampages, and if you kill them, you get Apex materials for ramping up your weapons. Ramping up your weapons allows you to set unique rampage skills to weapons. Oh fuck! stop? Fuck, holy shit. When do you stop? When do you stop, game? God, oh, and there's a dog? On top of streamlining many of Monster Hunter's previously cumbersome mechanics, World also tutorialized its own systems with far more efficiency than previous entries. It largely taught the player how to play through gameplay, button prompts to learn the controls, being made to do the stuff you're going to have to do later on, instead of just having it explained to you. It was still labyrinthian in a lot of aspects, but a huge step forward regardless. Rise keeps almost all of these quality of life changes, evolves some of them, and even introduces some new ones of its own, but it tells the player through a veritable rampage of text boxes, popping up left and right and inundating the new player with a whole slew of information they likely won't even be able to comprehend until they test it out in gameplay, like they would be doing if they were starting World. All this whilst what I believe to be the series' first ever vocal hub theme plays in the background, which, hey, is cool and all, but this is why we don't put songs with lyrics in our videos, because it's really hard to concentrate. Can you hear me? Can you focus on what I'm saying? Are you able to focus on what I'm saying? Okay, I'll come back later. So with all this in mind, you have a game that is just as, if not even more convenient than Monster Hunter World, but in my opinion is less beginner friendly. And considering that this game is likely going to be reaching a whole load of potential new players by virtue of it being on the Switch, then hey, maybe less text boxes, more prompts. If you can stick it out and get over that hump though, you'll be able to quantify just how much dynamism Rise has brought to the table. The Palamute, a clear evolution of the Tail Raiders from Monster Hunter World's expansion Iceborne, alongside the aforementioned Wire Bug, make traversing the game's massive maps a total breeze. When prior to the inclusion of the Tail Raiders, it could be an absolutely momentum-draining odyssey in World. It was very easy to get caught in the crossfire of a monster fight in World, one monster audaciously barging in to beef with the one you were hunting, and turning you instantly from heroic hunter to pulverized punching bag in the game's all-too-frequent giant lizard dick-swinging contests. This was only compounded by the fact that World's focus on the world often led it to making these more boxed-in, claustrophobic maps, encrusted with stunning detail and realistic habitats for the game's plentiful and colourful endemic life, but not particularly appropriate for fighting off Toby Karate or whatever the fuck his name is. Rise's comparative focus on verticality and mobility has opened these maps up. They feel more reminiscent of the arena-like zones of classic Monster Hunter, and thus the act of simply fighting a monster is less free-for-all clown fiesta and more wild western standoff, both combatants waiting patiently for the other to make a move, carefully studying their adversary's movements, fully prepared to give their opponent an opening should they miss their chance. Except the Rajang, of course. He's a war criminal. The game's core combat is especially relieved of its baggage now that the monsters seem to have had their AI tweaked a little bit, such as that they rarely, if ever, hover around the same zone as another monster and turn it into a bomb site. They more often just leave it as soon as another enters, or sometimes engage in a scripted and ultimately harmless turf war before going separate ways. And I don't think it would be inaccurate to say that fighting a primarily flying monster like the Legiana with a melee weapon like the Dual Blades in World often felt a bit like fighting a bowl of soup with a fork. Rise, with its newfound mobility mechanics and Wire Bug, have circumvented the tedium of such fights almost entirely, and when you combine such additions with the map changes, the monster AI changes, and all the ways it strips away some of the occasionally ear-piercing bells and whistles World brought with it, Monster Hunter Rise is only the latest case file in a cornucopia of mounting evidence that in terms of pure gameplay, Monster Hunter, much like a horny Savannah bonobo, just keeps topping itself. Yes, that is the worst line in this video. I did say we peaked early. There is another side to this though. In its pursuit of pristine combat, Rise forgoes a lot of the little touches that left my PS4 powered on for nearly 100 hours in my university dorm in January of 2018. When you capture a monster in World, you can go back to the hub and physically see it restrained in a pen with whatever damage you did to it during the fight still visibly present. In Rise, there is no such pen. In World, you could capture endemic life with the capture net and then plant them around your room and have them as pets, further cementing in my mind that Monster Hunter was just Pokemon for those of us who have managed to pass through the 5 stages of grief. Whilst I still believe this to be true, there is no capture net in Rise, and significantly less room customization. And in World, different monsters had differing levels of aggression. You could peacefully stroll side by side with some of the biggest and most terrifying monsters in the game, and they'd never so much as even puff their chest out at you as long as you weren't actively antagonizing them. Every monster in Rise is aggressive to you should you stay in their vicinity for more than about 10 seconds, which I think is done to streamline the core gameplay loop, but it does feel like it undoes a lot of the characterization that World gave to these monsters. I've sat here and compared World and Rise a lot so far for, I believe, very justifiable reasons, but I want to look a bit more at Rise on its own merits, and in order to do so, I need to give you a quick little primer on the Deview and what it is, because if you haven't seen the original one where I explained the series concept, or just picked it up along the way through intuition, which is something I don't actually expect many people to have been able to do, you may be a bit confused, and I also wonder how you made it this far. The Deview is a series in which I am attempting to review a game whilst also never referring to anything in said game as good or bad, nor can I use any of either word's myriad of synonyms as descriptors either. I can still use these words, just not in the context of talking about the game that is being deviewed. Every sentence I attempt to word in such a way that it could hypothetically be interpreted to have a totally different meaning if someone read it off a transcript, or if I said it with a slightly different intonation. I've almost definitely fucked this up multiple times already and will continue to do so, and that's okay, because in case you haven't noticed, it's a really dumb idea for a series, and it's primarily a vehicle for silly jokes. By imposing silly, arbitrary restrictions on myself, I'm forced to get wordy and use all these ridiculous metaphors and similes and comparisons. Not being able to say that anything is good or bad, and abstaining from giving any kind of rating at the end, forces me to get creative, and that's way more fun than "I like Monster Hunter because the combat is good." That's paraphrasing "get off my delightfully toned arse." So with this series' limitations in mind, Monster Hunter Rise presents a particularly interesting logistical challenge. I wanted to talk about the game's monsters, but look at the names of some of these early game monsters. Maybe I could find a loophole in my own rules to get around this, but any way you slice it, these are not Deview-friendly names. And as always, I'm gonna have to get creative. Thus, for the remainder of this Deview, these monsters shall be known henceforth as Interesting Izuchi, Bewildering Baggy, and Reasonable Roggy. Even with the series concept being what it is, let me go on record as saying that Reasonable Roggy is my best friend. And if anyone were to so much as lay a finger on him, I'd be forced to make a full armor set out of their family. Monster Hunter Rise has very obvious Japanese theming going on. Everywhere you look there's Japanese symbolism, references to religion, mythology and culture, most of it feudal but some of it modern as well. You can see this very clearly in the new monsters the game introduces, all of them inspired by yokai, or creatures of Japanese folklore. Interesting Izuchi was based on the Kamaitachi, devilish creatures that ride on dust devils and cut people with scythe-like hands. The Gosrag is based on the Namahage, demons said to descend from snowy mountains to scare those who have been lazy or wicked. The Tetranodon is based on the Kappa, an amphibious demon or imp, and also partially based on a sumo wrestler. And of course there's the Magna Mallow, which is basically Yoshimitsu from Tekken on 4 legs. I think Monster Hunter Rise might be the first game in the series to use a specific theme to fuel the design of its new monsters. I'm not counting Monster Hunter 3 having a bunch of sea creatures for the underwater combat mechanics here. Monster Hunter games have more giant lizards in them than the UK's Houses of Parliament. Most of them are content to say, hey, here are the new monsters, some dinosaurs, some dragons, some hybrid animals, with a bit of variation where the programmers can handle it. But with Rise using a specific theme to inform its design decisions, not just monsters but music and visuals as well, it has more creative syntax, i.e. more creative consistency than any previous entry. This all being said, video games sure do love their Japanese culture, don't they? It wasn't that long ago that I was playing Crash 4, and this feudal Japan-themed world of levels just kind of popped up out of nowhere. It got me to thinking, how come we see Japanese culture and mythology represented in video games so much more so than just about any other culture in the world? I mean, the obvious answer is that a lot of video games are made in Japan, and thus a lot of their culture just kind of seeps into games as a whole, sometimes unintentionally, but often intentionally as well. But then I started to wonder, could you do a similar thing to what Monster Hunter Rise did with Japanese culture culture with, say, I don't know, English culture? It kind of made me realise that I don't actually know a lot of my own history. The history we're taught in school is very spotty and often pretty patriotic, and I've always heard through the grapevine, and never through any of my history teachers, that we Brits have done a lot of things that could very understandably be filed under not very cash money. If you wanted to make a Monster Hunter game with medieval England as your thematic spine, where would you even start? What would the monsters be? Would you use Bloody Mary? Do you guys have Bloody Mary anywhere else? Apparently she's a ghost or a spectre of some sort, and if you say her name 3 times, she appears behind you and kills you or some shit. Good thing I only said Bloody Mary twice, huh? Bouncing off my previous point, maybe Japanese culture and mythology is represented so much more in video games because they're one of the only big name players on the world stage today that can be proud of their history. I mean, I'm sure they've done some horrendous shit too, everyone did back in the day, but I mean comparatively, you know? Like, I doubt they've got us or Germany beat. Whatever it comes down to tell you the truth, before Monster Hunter Rise came out, I was frankly kinda over it. Feeling like I'd seen the same symbolism and imagery in so much media all over the place, I was just a bit fatigued of it all. Now that Monster Hunter Rise is out, all I have to say is Watashi wa mara sukoshin zari shiteyamasu, jisai wa. Which brings me beautifully into a brand new Deview exclusive segment, the Deview Word of the Day. How exciting. That's right, every Deview I will now aim to teach you a new word for you to brandish in your arsenal. Maybe you'll already be familiar with this word, but maybe I'll teach you something you didn't already know about it. Our debut Deview word of the day is raconteur. So in the realm of Japanese classical theatre exists this kind of performance known as a kabuki play. It's typically done in 5 acts, and one of the many things that defines it is its focus on the actors themselves, as opposed to jojuri plays, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, which are far more concerned with the sanctity of the characters and the fiction. Kabuki plays would often insert or remove scenes entirely to cater to and magnify the actors. Scenes that actors were well known for or just particularly good at were generally favoured over ones that kept the plot airtight. And so you have this grand lore of specific actors who were amazing at specific scenes that inflate bouncy castle-like into legends and myths of these actors. The people are more important than the characters. And as a further illustration of just how intrinsically linked drama and comedy are, we have raconteur comedy. The word raconteur originates from the old French verb raconter, which means to tell. A raconteur, in simple terms, is someone who is really good at telling stories. They're able to suck people into their tales and weave interesting narratives out of otherwise mundane experiences. Many comedians are simply there to tell jokes in a more traditional sense, fire off zingers and one-liners all over the place, but there are also the raconteur comedians, the ones who make themselves the centerpiece of their performance by telling stories and making them funny, thus becoming themselves more important than the fiction, as it were, more important than the jokes. The concept of a raconteur was a lot more prevalent generations ago in different cultures where people would use the term more frequently and specifically seek out raconteur comedy, which was also often performed in acts, much like a kabuki play, though to be fair, just about every comedy performance has an intermission. Considering the frequent anecdotes and personal musings, you could consider the Deview itself to be its own kind of raconteur comedy. And next time you tell all your pals and other of your riveting knee slappers, be sure to give them a raconteur of the shiny new word you just learned, eh? But don't use it like that, because that won't make sense. Monster Hunter Rise introduces a photo mode. Monster Hunter Rise's photo mode has ruined my life. From the moment I discovered that you could set the pictures of monsters in your hunter's notes to pictures that you had actually taken of them, I became obsessed. I vowed to get a picture of every single large monster in the game saved to my favourites in something close to the order that you fight them in-game. I became obsessed with getting pictures of them in different maps during different times of the day. Look at this album I've created. So many breathtaking snapshots of these creatures taken here that would never see the light of day if I didn't include them in this video. Seriously, look at some of these. They're unbelievable, right? Look at this picture of the Magna Mallow. Have you ever seen a better picture of the Magnum Mallow? Nay, have you ever seen a better picture of anything in your life? No, you haven't. Stop lying to yourself. Everything about it, the lighting, the angle, the dynamic pose, everything about this beast's nature is immaculately captured in this one frame. This is what dedication looks like. This is lightning in a bottle. In the final week of March 2021, Monster Hunter Rise's photo mode ruined my life. You know, I want to just circle back to something I said earlier real quick. I was talking about how Monster Hunter Rise doesn't have as many of the little touches as Monster Hunter World, but something I neglected to mention is this cute little thing it does with the series monster icons. Previous Monster Hunter games feature these blocky, kinda Aztec-looking, cave painting-like icons to preview a monster you're about to hunt. Rise ditches these icons in favour of more fashionable but perhaps less distinctive watercolour variations of these icons in keeping with its Japanese theming. I won't tell you which one I prefer, but the fact that such a small thing was changed to be consistent with the game's theme says a lot about Capcom's absurd attention to detail with this series. That very attention to detail is frankly disquieting sometimes. I recommended Monster Hunter World to a friend of mine a couple years back, and I remember them asking me why I got into the series. Not that they weren't enjoying it, they just wanted to know. And I couldn't help but feel like this question was somewhat out of the blue, but I took a moment to ponder it, and eventually the conclusion I came to was that I liked animals. I can say that, it's not about the game, I love animals. I think they're pretty neat. If I weren't so hell-bent on entertaining, I'd probably work with animals, train to become a vet or a zoologist or something. When you badly injure a monster in Monster Hunter, they start to sadly limp away from you in an attempt to escape, often whimpering or letting out other sounds of distress as they do so. And in a game that's so otherwise full of cartoony and easy to shrug off violence, this is a moment of piercing realism. One that, to me, always feels too real. And it incites all kinds of feelings in me that I wish I didn't have to feel in a game that had just a few moments earlier had my heart racing, got the endorphins flowing. Am I being a bleeding heart here? I don't think so. I was somewhat of a monster hunter myself at one point, you know. In late 2012, shortly after I moved house, my family and I went to a cat rehoming centre in search of monsters, and we found exactly the kind of thing we were looking for. A pair of kittens in need of a new home, a brother and a sister, a black and white kitten named Rosie, and a Russian blue with no tail by the name of Teddy, which we would shorten to Ted pretty much every time we referred to him. Not even a year old at the time, they came home with us, and they were perfect. Communicative, affectionate, adorable. We fell in love pretty much instantly. They adapted to life here quickly, and things went pretty swimmingly for a year and a half or so. I remember very vividly being sat down on my bed with my back up against the wall, fighting the Gypsaros in Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate. It must have been in late 2014, because that's when the game came out and we'd only had the cats for about 2 years, when very uncharacteristically, my mum barged into my room without knocking. There were tears in her eyes. Ted had just been hit by a car. The driver didn't inform us either, they just drove off without saying anything. We only found out what had happened through a neighbour, meaning he was just lying there motionless out in the middle of the road for God knows how long. When I went out to see for myself, there was my brother, practically scraping him off the pavement in a towel. All three of us were obviously incredibly panicked, and honestly what happened in the immediacy from there is a total blur. He was breathing, but bloody, with a huge gash in his head and almost entirely unresponsive. We got him to a vet as soon as possible, and she told us under no uncertain terms that while he was still alive now, he wouldn't make it through the week. So we decided that if he was gonna die, then he might as well die at home surrounded by his family rather than scared and alone on a cold vet's table. We took him back and he was just in another world. He could barely walk, he'd sometimes collapse when he tried, but more often he'd just walk around in circles aimlessly, like he didn't know where he was or where to go. He couldn't eat or drink on his own, we had to try and do it for him manually without making him choke. My family and I decided to watch him in shifts overnight. Each of us would take a 4-hour shift, set alarms and swap just to watch him, make sure he didn't hurt himself and see what happened. As we did this, something weird occurred. The week went by. He wasn't dead yet, he still couldn't handle stairs, and he was still bumping into things and walking in circles all the time, but the vet was wrong. Slowly, he began responding to stimuli again. The next step was to get him used to movement and direction. Here's an embarrassing story. I walked him. I walked my cat. We got him a little lead for like very small dogs, and so that we could get him used to moving again, we all walked him around the house every so often. Eventually, he started climbing stairs again. I mean, he did so with all the upwards momentum of a slinky, but he was climbing stairs. Then, it was time for him to be reintroduced to the outside world. This meant walking him outside. In front of people. Yes, I got lots of very strange looks. I'd just take him around the perimeter of the house, but I'd still bump into a dog owner every now and then. Have to sheepishly pick him up and just walk away with him in my arms. No time to explain. As I make this video, it's been 7 years since that vet told us that Ted had no chance of surviving the week. Ted, how do you feel about surviving a car crash that you were told in no uncertain terms that you would not make it through? Give me the Hollywood treatment, I see. Yeah. Ted, do you have any words to the fans at home? Wow. Sorry, he's got places to be. Oh. What are you doing? What are you doing, buddy? That is my foot. Yep, he's got his claw stuck. He's got his claw stuck in my foot. Ted. You're dumb. He turns 10 in August. He definitely still feels the effects of it today. He finds himself generally confused in a lot of scenarios. He's very vocal. He meows at seemingly nothing all the time, I suspect out of confusion. He still walks in circles every so often, bumps into things no ordinary cat would, gets into places he's clearly not supposed to be. He's probably not going to live to be that old in the grand scheme of things, but he's already lived 7 years longer than we were told he would. Ted, much like his good pal over here, isn't exactly what you'd call all there, and he's been made indestructible because of it. And so I have to ask, do I need to watch this monster sadly limp away from me every time? One of the many conveniences Rise introduces is a blue icon that indicates when a monster is weakened and ready for capture, alongside a text prompt from your palico letting you know the same thing. In previous Monster Hunter games, you kinda needed to keep an eye out for when the monster started limping, because that was your best way of knowing when it was ready to be captured. I mean, even in Rise, it's not exactly realistic shrinking horse balls. It does have a purpose, and it does make sense. It's just, I don't know. I know this is a personal thing, but nothing stops my fun dead in its tracks like having to watch this, or collecting a wyvern tear dropped by the monster I just kind of walked up to and started beating the fuck out of for no reason. Monster Hunter as a series, much like Pokemon, has historically been able to downplay the barbarism of its core concept quite a bit, but then something like this happens. It's stuff like this that makes me reflect on my time with World and the changes Rise made. Probably a large part of the reason I spent nearly 100 hours on World in its first week, aside from the obvious, was my insistence on capturing monsters instead of killing them. Seeing a monster fearfully limp away from me after I attacked it with no provocation whatsoever practically guilt-tripped me into doing so. In Rise, they're all arseholes, so it hasn't unsettled me quite as much. Still though, while this feature hasn't been done away with, and probably justifiably so, it makes me begin to consider Rise's stripping back of realism in favour of gameplay compared to World's incomparable but sometimes unsettling attention to detail. I can't say what the right approach is, but I know one of them had me glued to the screen more than the other, and occasionally made me kinda sad deep down. Monster Hunter is a weird series because every time a new one is revealed and a bunch footage of the new monsters are shown off, people collectively go, "Whoa, that monster looks awesome, I love that one. Can't wait to fucking slaughter it and wear it as a hat." Despite my own aversion to the limping feature, I occasionally find myself flirting with the same thoughts as these people, so I want to ask, what have you done to us, Monster Hunter? How is it that you've made an alternate reality zoologist have such thoughts? How do you do this to us? Truly, if Monster Hunter has its way, it will soon make frothing barbarians of us all. If Ted ever saw me playing Monster Hunter after all we've been through, I think he'd judge me. And you know what? I reckon he'd be right to do so. Very few other games streamline the process of having big, crazy fights where you're the underdog like Monster Hunter does. It's a game where every enemy is a boss battle, and the final boss is a rock opera. It's a constant stream of being like, I've got to fight that thing, and then you do, and you win. And then being like, I've got to fight that thing, and then you do, and you win. And then being like, I've got to fight that thing, and then you do, and you win. I mean, that one was a fish. I don't know why you're surprised by that. Monster Hunter Rise is not a main series Monster Hunter game like World or the numbered Monster Hunter games. It's directed by Yasunori Ichinose, who's most well known for his work on the portable series of Monster Hunter games. I haven't played any of these myself, but I know that Ichinose's games are known to have more of a classic Monster Hunter feel, and are also acclaimed for their flashier and often far sillier weapon designs. Here I have a pair of dual blades that look like Magnum revolvers. How did I get them? Doesn't matter, don't ask. But, one question. Are they generally known to have very hollow endings at launch? I mean, World had a lot of add-on content still to come in January 2018, but when you quote-unquote finished it in 2018, the conclusion still had a sense of finality to it. Rise, much like this following sentence, leaves a lot. Despite the challenges of this series format, I am going to attempt, quite unlike Monster Hunter Rise, to give you a fulfilling conclusion right now. Even though it only began in the mid-2000s, Monster Hunter is a series that already has its own very distinguished identity. It has its own culture, if you will. Usually, a series has to be retro before it can have such recognisability, but all it took was a pair of feet to be shown, followed by a fiery sword swiped from an unknown entity at the end of a Monster Hunter World Iceborne story trailer in June 2019, for people to know that Glavenus was coming back. The very frame that a pair of piercing red eyes appeared in the final Monster Hunter Rise trailer, everyone knew that Naga Kuga had just been confirmed. Most people know what Rathalos and the Palicos are at this point, because the more Monster Hunter changes, the more it stays the same. Monster Hunter Rise makes a lot of changes, and it is still so Monster Hunter. What that means for you, I don't know. What it means for me is that I'm gonna turn around, make sure Ted isn't watching, and get the fuck back in there. Hey, fun little bit of news. I am now affiliated with Patchwork. Patchwork are an up-and-coming esports organisation in the UK. I've been good friends with the guys in charge and a lot of the guys involved for a while now, and they reached out to bring me on as a content creator. And I figured, well, I know these guys, I trust these guys, I believe in these guys, why not have a mutually beneficial relationship, right? So you can expect us to be collaborating on some fun things here and there for the foreseeable future, and I think you should go give them a follow at their socials and whatnot, especially if you're interested in games like Smash and Valorant, because they're really good, and they're only going to keep getting better, and now I'm one of them. So what the frick else do you need? Thank you, as always, to my highest tier patrons: Cheesy Chip, Captain L, Mike Craig, Charnucky, Chris Monk, Cousin Boneless, Derek Drost, Dixie Normus, Elliot Joyce, Flashing Fire, GP, Garm, Heist Van Duren, Good Chicken, Isaac, Isaac Beardswood, Isaac Vermeer, Justin Mills, Kavan Green, Mike Archer, Raven, Super, Swagboy, Tale of the Toaster, The Ghost of Karl Marx in 4D, Waldington, and Will Gone, or Gone. I'm sorry, I do not know. If you want to make use of your patronage at literally any level, including the lowest possible tier, then you might as well go ahead and do so and vote on that there poll I just showed you to decide the next Deview, and I will see you then.